Welcome to Share.Care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.Care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.Care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello and welcome to the Share.Care podcast. Our belief is that global peace starts at home. Feeling safe, valued and heard gives you a foundation to confidently step out and make the world a happier and safer place for everyone. Because in today's world, it's in your own selfish best interest to help others. Now today, we have Dr. Laura Ellick, who is our special guest. Now, Dr. Ellick is a psychologist with 20 years of experience working with children, teens, and adults, and specializing in addressing anxiety, trauma, depression, and work-life balance. Dr. Ellick is also the author of Wisdom from the Universe and Total Wellness for Mommies. Welcome, Dr. Ellick.
Hi, it's so nice to see you.
Likewise, great to have you on the show as well. Now, would you like to start by telling us a little bit about your background, some of the challenges that you faced that have led you to do what you're doing now?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I have to just say that I'm so inspired by your message because that's really kind of where my business, my focus has been going over the past several years. So I'm licensed as a psychologist. I did, tons of schooling to get where I wanted to be, did a lot of training, but I have to say, the school was great, being a psychologist was great, but it was all of the experiences that I have had outside of that training that really have influenced where I'm heading today. So I have a really big interest in foreign languages. I did a double major in psychology and Spanish. So I studied Spanish, Portuguese, and French while I was in college.
Wow.
And I always thought that, speaking another language would be like being allowed into a special group, or you would have a code, a secret code that would allow you into other worlds. So traveling and bringing access to care to people who may not be able to have it otherwise, whether because of a language barrier or socioeconomic barrier, that's been huge for me. But I have to say, probably the most pivotal moment for me was being just a young kid, being bullied horrendously as a fifth grader, and just really trying to figure out why there's so much hate and anger in the world and trying to find some way to shift that. As I get older, have my own kids, have gone through other bullying experiences at workplace and other relationships, and just figuring out what we can do to shift that and lead us into a place where we're leading from a place of compassion and love instead of anger and hate.
Wow, that must have been fairly traumatic being bullied as a kid. And I know that a lot of people experience that as children, well, even as adults too, but certainly children experience that. From that, let's talk on that, because there's probably people that are, I would say, there's certainly people that have gone through that experience or maybe going through that experience. What should someone that is being bullied do from that perspective? How should they approach that?
Well, I think that's the crux of the problem is, especially in the olden days, we weren't really taught to lead by compassion and love, or to take another person's perspective, or to think of things from that. We were taught, be bigger than the bully. If the bully offers to fight you, hit back with anger, be more intimidating than the bully, right? So the idea was, don't let anyone knock you down, and be tougher, and say you're going to meet that bully for, that playground argument. That kind of wasn't my style. So it didn't work very well for me. So I found that, even what the culture and what the world was able to offer me at the time didn't fit me as a person. So a lot of the work that I'm doing now, whether it's in toxic relationships, whether it's in relationships where one person has an addiction and the other person doesn't, is we're looking at breaking behavior and emotion chains. Because if you respond to anger with anger, if you respond to intimidation with intimidation, you are just repeating and escalating the chain. There's no chance for de-escalation and neutralization, right? We're just adding more fuel to the fire. And so this is something, as I've learned as I've gotten older, is why are we teaching people to be tougher than the bully? We don't need to back down, but we don't need to engage either.
So is that like to do with, for example, being empathetic, being empathetic with the bully themselves, or is that what you're referring to?
Well, listen, people are afraid of being a wimp, right?
Yeah.
So you can set boundaries without being a wimp.
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't mean that you have to fight somebody. So if a bully is in your face, you can say, all right, you're super angry right now. I'm not going to meet you where you're at. And of course, this language doesn't work for fifth graders, but I'm just kind of giving you an idea.
Yeah.
I'm not meeting you where you're at. We'll talk later. And you can just kind of walk away. I had a situation a couple of years ago where I was bullied really mercilessly, and it was on Facebook. So it went public. And so there were all of these comments of people saying very, very hateful things to me. And so what we normally want to do is respond with anger, like, cut that out, I'm going to sue you, this and that. But what I actually did was I went back channel and I said to every single person, I am so sorry that that's the way you feel about me. I'm so sorry if I ever gave you that impression. And that shut people down right away, more than any anger would, right? Because anger causes people to escalate more. And people backtracked. They said, oh, no, I didn't mean it that way, or I didn't take it that way, or no, that wasn't what I meant. And I thought how powerful it is to be able to change that pattern without using more anger. People expect anger. They're geared up for a fight.
A lot of the times, would it be fair to say that, especially on social media, and that happens a lot now for younger people, that people are doing it for that reaction? Is that something that you experience? And what you're doing there is you're saying, well, don't react in the way that's expected, react in a way that's not expected, and in a way that also will help diffuse the situation. Is that
right? And genuine, right? Like, you're not going to say anything that isn't genuine. I truly was sorry that people had this impression of me, that they were believing things that were not true about me. I was really sorry about that. And I was willing to clarify what had gone on to any person who asked me. Nobody ever did. But what I find is really interesting is the culture as a whole, since 2020, at least in the US, has become very angry, very geared for a fight. We've been in lockdown. People have been in horrendous situations. They've lost jobs. So everybody is sort of primed to respond in a different way. And I think that the message is, yes, people are primed that way, but you don't have to engage in it.
So is that sort of like to say, with that, when you say you don't have to engage it, I remember one of my favorite movies is Patrick Swayze movie called Roadhouse. It's an 80s movie. I'm a bit older than I look. But I remember him giving a speech in that where he talks about, what he said, what if someone calls you an asshole? And apologies for people that find that offensive while they're listening to this podcast, but I'm not going to beep it out. But because from the example, he says, well, what it is that's just two words combined to elicit a prescribed response. Now, from that perspective, if you, where do you need to stand, like, emotionally as a person, to be able to step back and say, okay, this person's trying to elicit a response. I can react emotionally and take a defense? Or is that something to do with your own psychology or your own belief in yourself, and go, well, that's their opinion. If they had called me a potato, for example, how would I react? Is that
Right.
is that part of the equation that we need to consider here from your experience?
Absolutely. I think people have become reactive, and they don't really take a pause and recognize what's going on inside of them, right? So, the issue at the end of the day is someone called you an asshole. So what? Right? Does it
Yeah.
make it true just because they called you an asshole?
Yeah.
So, but if you escalate and punch them out, now you are acting like an asshole.
That's a great point.
Right. So it's really recognizing that, look, just because everyone has an opinion doesn't mean it's your opinion. Now we don't practice these things or think these things through ahead of time, right? Because we don't have this emotional education in our culture. I don't know what it's like in other countries. We definitely don't have it. So, when that happens to someone, the initial thing is, oh, I'm going to prove to you I'm not. But really, when you get in a bar fight with someone, you're acting like an asshole.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point there, where you're saying you're going to prove that you're not, and by doing it, you're actually proving that you are. Whereas if you step
Right.
above, like you said, um, does that, I mean, I would imagine to that response that, get heightened sense of, well, anxiety, which is part of what you deal with in a large part of your practice, is dealing with anxiety and depression. How does that, I mean, how can a person take that and be aware, okay, I'm creating this anxiousness in myself, and then diffuse themselves? Is that something is there certain techniques that they could use to do that, or how would they approach that?
Oh, totally. And this is like so absolutely cool. So I watch a lot of different people on YouTube, but one of the things that really fascinates me is this concept of fight or flight. So if you remember from your biology days, and some people may not, but fight or flight is an evolutionary mechanism that's designed to help us if we're being confronted by a woolly mammoth, right? So the idea is we're either going to run or we're going to stay and we're going to fight. What happens is because our culture has become so angry, and because we're so geared up, and because we have social media at us 24/7, human beings right now are probably chronically in fight or flight. We
Hmm.
are chronically like awaiting that thing, whether it's the boss firing you, whether it's the economy dropping out, whatever it happens to be. We secrete certain chemicals when we're in fight or flight. We secrete adrenaline, we secrete cortisol. Those chemicals are awesome in the short term. But what they actually do is they do things like, all of your oxygen, all of your blood needs to go to your extremities in order to fight or flee. That means blood and oxygen is being drained from your brain. That's your rational thinking part,
Yeah. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So that's how bar fights happen.
Yeah.
That's how arguments add on a checkout line when someone has 11 items in a 10 or fewer lane.
Yeah.
People are escalated, they go into fight or flight right away, and they're not thinking rationally. So the one step that I tell people before you do anything, take a breath.
Yeah.
Breathing stops the fight or flight, because think about it this way: your body cannot be physiologically anxious and relaxed at the same time.
Yeah.
You cannot be both. You're either relaxed or you're not. So when you take that breath, that's the first thing that someone can do when they're involved in one of those situations. It allows the oxygen and blood to go back into the brain and allows you to think a little bit more rationally about what you want to do next.
Yeah, so we have this situation where something happens, and then you've got this fight or flight. What about our focus? Like if we take your reticular activating system for example, and so we see what we want to see, and you can have two people having exactly the same experience, where one person will react differently, the other person will react. Or one person will react one way, another person will react in a completely different way to the same circumstance. How much of that is predicated by what we trained ourselves to see in that situation, or to observe in to feel or notice in that situation, and how can we change that as well if we want to do something different?
Well, I think we're all subject to the programming that we grew up with, right? So if you grow up in a certain household where things were said a certain way, where there was an angry tone, where there was a trauma, if you see a situation in your other life that is sort of similar, there's going to be some trigger feelings there. So, what I like to do with all of my clients, whether it's addiction, whether it's eating disorders, whether it's trauma, is we try to help people notice emotions and sensations in their body before they get to the point of no return. So if someone knows that when their anger is at an 8, their head is ready to explode and there's no way they're coming back from fight or flight, we want you to be able to recognize when your anger is a 3, right? Because that's your warning sign that I'm not going to let it get to an 8 or a 9, because I won't be able to pull it back then. So a lot of the work I do, I guess you would call it like somatic. There's so many different initials out there for things that people do. I've been doing all of this work for years. I just haven't called it anything other than what I do. But I notice particularly when I work with people who have addictions and eating disorders, they are very disconnected from the body and the emotion. And I think oftentimes that's because trauma is involved as well. They're just shut down. So if I ask them, where do you feel anger in the body? They have no idea.
Right.
So if they have no idea, it makes it that much more likely that as soon as someone says something to them, they're off and running.
So how would they recognize? I mean, what do they need to do to actually, if they've got no idea where this is where the anger is, how can they start to identify that? What are the steps they could do?
Bingo. So that's where the therapy comes in. So, we will talk about situations from their past. And I may notice, for example, you're looking kind of flat. Like, what's going on for you? Well, I don't feel anything. Okay, well, then we may take it outside of you. Well, if somebody else were in a similar situation, what do you think they might be feeling? And then you get at least some knowledge that there may be some emotional connection to that particular memory or circumstance. So a lot of times people can't recognize it in themselves, but they can see what somebody else might be feeling. And so it would be, well, where do you think in someone else's body they may experience anger? Oh, maybe it's in the stomach, maybe tense shoulders. And then, we'll coach them through, well, what are other situations in your life not tied to this trigger emotion where you may feel tense shoulders or a headache? So you're giving them the language, but everybody has one or two emotions that they really don't like feeling or expressing. So sometimes we get around it until it's safe enough to deal with that emotion.
Right. Okay. Because this is really interesting because, yeah, one of Cher's key principles is know yourself. So is what you're saying here is can someone do this by themselves, for example? Can they go through an experience where they might have got angry and see if that anger starts to crop up and notice where that might be? Or do they need to do it with someone like yourself? Or can
I'm very big on people being advocates for themselves, but a lot of times when you're dealing with things like trauma or anger, some really painful kind of stuff, you kind of want to do it with a trained professional because you don't want to uncork the bottle and not be able to cork it back up. And sometimes, especially with trauma, we don't necessarily know what we're going to be unleashing. So you want someone who can do it in a guided way where not too much is left out, let out at once.
Yeah, okay. So you and also have that support there to guide you as well. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Right.
And so with that type of, because we're mentioning about trauma as well. I mean, how does, when someone, you know, I would imagine that it might be difficult for someone to reach out to seek that assistance. What could someone, like if someone's experiencing, or had an experience with trauma and they're having difficulty, they're listening to the show now and want to reach out. I mean, what would give them the confidence to call someone like yourself and seek that assistance? What could they do?
Oh my gosh. I think just for them to know that there is a way out, you do not have to feel miserable. There are people out there who will help you. I've heard many, many people use the term, well, I have trauma, I have a lot of issues, I'm broken. And I just don't like that term. I've heard it in the media, I've heard it all over. I don't believe people are broken. I believe that people have gone through experiences that have hurt them, but I don't believe human beings are broken. I think we are very resilient. You see stories in the media all the time of people who have bounced back from things that you wouldn't have expected them to. If you don't find that connection with a therapist on the first try, keep trying because there is somebody who will definitely get you.
So is that a case too? Like sometimes you might meet with someone and it's not quite working. So really, it's not a case of this doesn't work. It's a case of maybe you didn't have the connection and you just need to try someone else. Is that?
Sure, it can totally be a mismatch. I mean, look, when people get married, right? Most of the time, you don't marry the first person that you meet.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? You kind of try it out for a little while. Make sure it's going to work. Make sure it's someone you kind of like the next day. It's the same thing with therapy. You want somebody who is on your side, who you're going to feel comfortable talking to about the deeper things.
Yeah. So it's not a quick fix, this will snap your fingers, everything's going to be okay. It's like you're saying, uncorking the genie is probably the opposite, where, the anger comes out. The fixing it takes a little bit more time to build that relationship. Is that fair to say?
Totally, totally. But you'll know within the first couple of sessions whether someone is really there with you and whether someone is really genuine.
Yeah. And what about, because you also deal with depression a lot as well, which is quite significant in our society today. How much of that depression is I find it really, my question is, how much does that depression connected to feeling alone, which is, and the two part to that is, today we live in the most connected society, where we've all got devices that connect to each other and all these things happening, yet we feel the most alone we've ever felt. So one is that a connection, quite consistent, and what can someone do to actually come back from that depression, that feeling of loneliness?
Oh my gosh, I love that you asked that question, because I just ran a group last week on this with a group in an addiction facility, and they were all giving an introduction to themselves, and the common theme in what everybody was saying about addiction was their addiction was really like triggered or had its influences in a lack of connection.
Right.
Stemming back from childhood. So yeah, there's, with depression and loneliness and isolation, we are tangentially connected to people. Like, I follow tons of people on TikTok. Am I really friends with them? No. Am I connected to them? Yeah. Is it a reciprocal connection? No. And I think what COVID did is, when we were locked down, and of course, there's reasons why that happened. I don't get into any of that, like political stuff, health stuff, whatever. But the end result was that people lost human touch. People lost connection, like real connection. We were all feeling so lost. We couldn't do the hobbies that we usually do, the things that bring us out of ourselves, that maybe are stress management for us. And when somebody has a lot of time alone with their thoughts, we tend to go down a negative spiral.
Yeah.
But I think one of the big problems in our culture today is a lack of connection, real connection.
Is that, when you say a lot of time alone with your thoughts, that really stands out to me? Is that because, they may not deep down like themselves as well? And I raise that, like with my son, when I'm raising him, I was always very much telling him, ask him, does he like himself? Doesn't matter what I think. You're everything to me. I said to him, and they stole my line in the movie June, like, because I've always said to him, "You're everything you ever need to be. You're my son. Whatever you do, that's all you need to be." But it doesn't matter what I think. Do you like yourself? And he's grown up. He's 14 now, and he's very calm, and he likes himself. And is that when you talk about this, when you're alone with your own thoughts, is it a case of we're thinking about ourselves in a negative way, and we need to shift that? And is that where gratitude might come into that as well?
I think we do have a tendency to focus on the negative when we're alone.
Right.
Especially if there's just been a breakup, or there's been a downturn, or let's say there's COVID. Human beings like predictability. One of the difficult things about COVID was, number one, it was sudden. Everybody thought they were going home for a long weekend, and then the world shut down. And the other thing was, nobody knew when it was going to end. Now, that's a recipe for disaster for human beings. I mean, we're set up to have an average body temperature of 98.6. We like homeostasis. So for us to not know what's coming next, our major coping skill has been ripped out from under us. The idea of predictability, and, if it's only 3 months, I can handle 3 months. I know what 3 months is like. So we get alone in our thoughts. Is this always going to happen? I'm alone during COVID. Does that mean I'm always going to be alone? School is awful right now. Is it always going to be awful? Will we go back to the way it was before? It's a lot of these spinning thoughts. And as a parent myself, I hear what you're saying about trying to fill your kids up with enough love and self-assurance at home, but then they go out into the world where they're exposed to kids whose parents may not have done that for those kids. And those kids have an influence on your kid. They bully them. They tell them that they're wearing the wrong thing, that whatever it happens to be. And then they question. That's their first exposure to the real world. Well, my parents love me, but they're supposed to say that. But all of these kids don't. So who's the real me?
Interesting. Yeah. So there is that how do we deal with that then? What can we do to, like, coming back to the children again? How can we help them step out when there is that can be that negativity, and come back to that predictability as well that you're talking about, to give them the confidence of how to deal with things?
I think teaching our kids the coping skills to recognize that whatever life throws at you, that's external, and how you deal with everything is internal. So even if the world is a mess, you can control your own environment internally. You can set up a school desk for you. You can reach out and make friends with the people who you want to make friends with. What I've always told my kids is, look, if these kids are bullying you, or if these kids don't like you, they've just screened themselves out of your life. Good for them. You don't have to do anything now. They don't need to be a part of your team.
Yeah.
That just allows other people to come into your life now, the people who maybe are suited for you.
And is that, like, I mean, from that perspective, I think, I mean, do people just want to be liked? Is that, I mean, do we need to be liked by everybody? Is that something that we need to do, or because that, I would imagine that causes a great deal of anxiety. Is like, for example, you might go for a job interview and you might not get it. I've applied for a lot of jobs that I've rejected for, and it's like, initially I would be like upset. It's like, why don't they want me? But then, after enough rejections, enough job doing, because I did a variety of different jobs when I was younger, it became, it's just part of the system. And maybe is that part of that predictability, having enough experience to go through, well, this is just part of life and not something to be worried about? Is that one way of approaching it?
I think that's so great, because everybody wants to be liked, right? I don't know anybody who doesn't want to be liked, right? And so, if you're rejected for a job, it totally hurts. So I think it's acknowledging that part, but then also recognizing from the intellectual perspective, a lot of college selection, let's say, or team selection or job selection, a lot of it is a numbers game. A lot goes into it that we have nothing to do with behind the scenes. Maybe they need a certain number of this major or a certain number of this major. We don't have any control over that. What we do have control over is making sure our resume or our grades are as good as they can possibly be. When we do an interview, is it an accurate representation of ourselves? And at the end of the day, and this is where the spiritual piece comes in, where it's kind of like, just leave it up to the universe. If it didn't work out, it's probably because it's not going to be a good match for you, and something better or something that's more fitting will come along.
It's interesting you mentioned that too, and that's what really stood out for me when I was reading your book and your website, was you do take this spirituality approach, and that's where you're putting it out to the universe. And I had a similar experience where I applied for a job. And I didn't get it. It was something I really, really wanted. It was for it was a professional firm in corporate recovery that I wanted to work for, and I didn't get it, and I was really upset about that. And eventually, I did get another job in corporate recovery, and what I found, what actually happened, was the firm that I got rejected from, they turned out to be dodgy brothers. Like, if I had have got that job, I would have ended up being tarnished with that reputation. But I ended up getting a job with two of the best partners and well known in the industry, and who took me under their wing and trained me. So how much of that, putting it out to the universe and just trusting that sometimes, how can we approach things that way, so that we actually, put ourselves to trust that things will work out? Is there something we can do to allow ourselves to do that?
I think it's so hard in the moment, especially for kids who haven't had enough of those experiences to trust enough. But I think it's almost like writing a journal of all of these experiences where I thought this was going to happen and it wound up being better for me, so that when you look back on it, you have that evidence. But in a lot of the groups that I run, I show this video on YouTube that Steve Jobs did. It's a commencement speech that he did for Stanford University. I don't remember how long ago it was, but it was about connecting the dots. Yeah. And he was talking about, he dropped out of college because he didn't like the pressure. I can't remember the full story. And he wound up, just for fun, taking a class on calligraphy. And that wound up starting his passion for fonts and all of those other things, which is what Apple became known for with its scripts and fonts and stuff like that. So he looked back on his life and said, all of these things that at the moment I thought were disasters just allowed me to pivot to the area where I was supposed to go.
Yeah. So how do we take that trust? Is there something we can do? Is it just a matter of reminding yourself of, because that's a great speech that you brought up. Another one of mine, similar, well, not mine, but Steve Jobs' ones that stood out for me. I've actually recorded it and got it on a video that I remind myself was, where he says, when you look at it, these things called life and everything that's invented in life, you have to remember that it was created by someone no smarter than you. So is it a case of having these little quotes to remind yourself, or you mentioned about, the groups that you're in and surrounding yourself with that, and how would a person go about doing that? What could they do to build that up?
I think surrounding yourself with like-minded people, number one, is great. So what happens a lot of times is as you elevate yourself, whether it's spiritually, personality-wise, you're in therapy, job-wise, the people who aren't on your energy level, let's say, the same vibe, the same goals, they kind of fall off a little bit. And that's kind of the way it's supposed to happen, so that you can actually meet up with the people who you're supposed to be with. You encourage each other. I think keeping a journal or a diary of past experiences where you thought it was going to be a disaster, but look at how great it worked out for you. I think having that, again, data points that you can go back to. And then if you are a spiritual person, there's tons of stuff online that you can look up and find a spiritual community that way. I think for younger kids and college kids, I think it's a lot easier. They have communities built in. For adults, I think it's really hard to find a community of like-minded people when you've had established friend groups. I still struggle with that myself. So, but I think that's where online, where that can actually be a connection piece instead of a disconnection piece. Finding people in online Facebook groups or whatever.
And that comes back to, I think, what you mentioned earlier about, if someone doesn't like you, well, it's like, well, that's fine, because I don't have to deal with you anymore, and just accepting that for what that is. Is that that sounds like what it's like. Having that attitude is what you're saying, is just going, okay, we have to narrow down to people that are actually going to be supportive of me, and when you recognize someone's not, letting them go and being part of that group. Is that what?
Right, absolutely. And I'll flip it around and I'll say it to my kids. Well, do you like everyone?
That's a good point.
Give me a list of people they don't like, and I say, okay, well, do you want them to stop their lives because you don't like them? Well, no. Okay, so then it's okay.
And there's lots of supportive groups out there too. I mean, Toastmasters would be a good example of that, where people are very, very supportive of each other. And it's, although people think it's about public speaking, and I'm a member of Toastmasters, but it's more about the community. The people are just really supportive. And one of the things we said was there's no failure in that room. So you can go there and you can just have a connection with people. Are they the kind of groups that people could reach out to? Or?
I think Toastmasters is a great idea. I think, what are some other groups? I think there are always online groups for if you have an addiction issue, AA, that's someone who's like-minded. I know that I'm going to be re-releasing my book, so I'm going to be doing some book clubs related to my books. So that's going to be an avenue for people to connect in that way. I've actually done some Googling on it, spiritual retreats that people can go to. In the US, there are probably some where you are, where you find like-minded people who just get together to sort of, make new friends and explore these new ideas.
Yeah. And is it more important to do that in person, or is online work as well?
Ooh, that's a great one. I have mixed feelings about the online. Personally, I happen to like the in-person connection. However, I've found that being online, especially with some of my patients, it allows me a view into their world. Like teenagers always want to show me their first day of school outfit, how their room is decorated. Like they want me to see other parts of their world that I wouldn't be able to see otherwise. So it does have an advantage that way. And if it's a question of you attending something or not going at all, then do the Zoom.
Yep. That's an interesting point that you raise, and I guess too that you with the online you have the ability to reach people that you may not be able to reach as well. I mean, like you and I are having a chat. You're in Florida, and I'm in Australia, in Melbourne, and so normally, for us to have that in-person conversation, it'd be a very long plane flight. So for the wider experience globally, I guess the online would help people reach other people that they might not be able to reach, and certainly people with disabilities. Would that be helpful for them as well?
Absolutely, and just from the cross-cultural perspective, I mean, I learned a lot about you and about where you live and rules in your country and things like that that I didn't know, and that was even before we got on this on this official conversation. I'm like, wow, these are things I just never knew about Australia. I think it's great. We are a global community, whether we want to admit it or not. What happens here affects you. What happens there affects us. We've just seen with the death of Queen Elizabeth. I know in our country, there was a huge response. There was mourning. I mean, people are affected by other people. So I think the more friends you can have cross-culturally, I think it helps us develop skills related to empathy.
That's an interesting point that you raised there too, because part one of Share's underlying principles is to it's an inclusive culture for everybody. And from that perspective, how does reaching out to people, or how does someone overcome the fear of reaching out? Because a lot of times we grow up with certain prejudice. Like one of my business partners, he's Iranian. Now, I grew up believing Iranians were terrorists that blew up planes because that's what was happening at the time when I was young and I was being molded. How can someone overcome that and say, well, actually, what can I learn from that person? Is there steps that they could take to do that?
I would say that the more that you can travel, the better off you are. Now, not everybody can go to Australia or Iran or all of these things, but there are other ways. There are lectures online. There are things that you can do. But I have to tell you, I had an opportunity business-wise a few years ago to go as a psychologist to volunteer in Ecuador for 2 weeks and to help work in a neurology clinic to help them with the backlog of intakes and things like that. And I learned so much about their culture that even reading in a book or seeing online, there was no other way to explain it. It is, so-called a third world country that has better internet service than any place I've been in the US. So, I mean, there were things that I learned where I was like, this is not what I thought a third world country is. I mean, so it really opened me up to my own thoughts and preconceived notions, good, bad, or indifferent, and how much other countries are invested in learning about the US, and we don't learn as much about them. It was a real eye-opener.
That's an interesting point that you raise. And if we're reaching out to other people, I know from my perspective, and I've been very fortunate to have traveled to a lot of places. And although I did mention I haven't been to the US yet, but I'm excited. And for the US people listening, I'm a big NASCAR fan. I do like the culture. Bit of a redneck. But from that perspective, when we look at considering reaching out to other people, what about things like basic needs? Because when I traveled, I noticed that most people wanted to enjoy their life. They wanted good things for their children. They wanted a special connection with their partner. How much of that is similar across cultures, and should we focus on as opposed to looking at differences?
Absolutely. I think at the end of the day, everybody wants love, connection, feeling accepted, having a safe place to land at home. Right? And safety in the culture, war is, a huge concern. I think everybody's concerned wherever you are with the economy, with food safety, with water safety. I mean, I think if we get down to brass tacks, we all have those same issues. And that's where the taking another person's perspective can also sort of reduce anger in interactions. At the end of the day, if this person is really angry about something inconsequential, something must have happened to them to make them this angry.
Yeah. So if you're dealing with someone, coming back to what we were started with about this anger and anxiety and like sort of bullying, it's being able to take that high road, so to speak, is that what you're saying? Take that high road and go, well, what's behind this? Is that asking those kind of questions? Is that helpful? Even if you don't do it out loud, but in person?
Right. It's helpful to me. But I've been teaching other people to do it. I teach my kids to do it too. Like, okay, I get it. I understand that this person is behaving in this particular way. But think about it. Why do you think they're behaving this way? People don't just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to annoy, Laura all day, or I think I'm going to bully this person all day. We don't wake up with that intention, so something must have happened.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I remember listening to a Wayne Dyer audio. It was one of my favorite, where he talked about the air hostess. He was getting really huffy with him, and he just said, "Oh, look, you must be having a bad day. Let me do that." And she would become very polite after that, and that sort of sounds exactly like what you were talking about at the start. It's like, "Oh, I'm sorry that you experienced that." Is that this kind of approach that works?
Absolutely. And I find that, look, it takes 2 minutes to listen to somebody else. And I observe this like at airports or, cashiers or whatever. I'll say to a cashier, hey, how are you today? And it sounds genuine. And I get their entire story. And I'll say, I'm sorry that you've been sick. I'm sorry this is a rough day. I hope you get to go home and enjoy your time. And it was literally 30 seconds out of my day, but it changed the tone for both of us because I might have been cranky. Now I'm just focused on someone else is having a cranky day too, and now we both feel better.
That's interesting you mentioned, because you also mentioned before about this internal focus, but when what you're saying is shift it externally to someone else, is that, and that takes it away from does that help reduce your feelings when you shift it outside, and how does that work?
Absolutely, because I think rumination is kind of selfish. When we get inside our own head, we only see things from one perspective, which is ours. And so, yeah, the world does look terrible right now. I did smudge my nail polish today. That's horrible. But then when I talked to somebody else who said she's sick and if she misses a day of work, she can't get her kid a birthday present, it's kind of like, ugh, you know. That's what I feel sorry about right now. That's the person who I want to help right now. I don't really care about my nails. I can cut them all off. Who cares?
Yeah. So what you're really saying there, and I'm going to add time, maybe it's a little bit of a joke here, but you're saying have the crocodile Dundee approach, where you walk around to everyone saying, "G'day, how you going?" Is that?
Right. But everybody is it doesn't take anything to say hello to somebody else. It really doesn't.
That's interesting. What about too, like if someone, like if you're feeling down and you're very much inside yourself going, "Oh, this is terrible, this is terrible." I mean, because we've all heard the analogy that it takes less muscles to smile than it does to frown. Can a person do that, like where they're feeling that, and then smile at someone else, and see what that reaction is? What could someone do to trigger that within themselves? Because you mentioned about having those awareness where they could go. Because I know from my experience, when I've been grumpy and I'll smile at someone, they'll smile back, and all of a sudden I feel better. But what can someone do to trigger that in themselves?
I think look in the mirror and smile at yourself. Look in the mirror and remind yourself of all of the people who loved you. I also have, and I encourage everybody to do this, set up like a box in your house of fun things, mood things. I have videos queued up on my YouTube. I'm a huge Eminem fan. I pop on one of his videos, something that makes me laugh, one of his videos that will make me laugh. So I have stuff queued up for me, so I know. But when I get to a point where I know nothing good is happening if I just stay in this house, I go out for a walk, and just having a couple people say hi to me pulls me out of myself. Physical activity will pull you out of yourself. Getting outside and talking to somebody else, even if it's the cashier at the grocery store, it pulls you out of your mindset.
Yeah. So again, coming back to that, having that community, or even like you said, just going for a walk and smiling at someone, will give you that shift. But staying internally in your own head is not a good place to be. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's dangerous.
Yeah. So for those listening, if you are feeling not, a little bit of depression or sad, go for a walk, smile at someone, and see what happens there. And if not, reach out to Laura as well.
Absolutely. I'll give you a big smile. I actually posted a video on Instagram about this, about two women who are cashiers at the grocery store that I go to every day. And no matter what happens, they smile, I smile, we chat. And the video that I posted on the two of them, I think has almost 7,000 views. And it's just starting your day right by saying hi to people.
So these are two cashiers that you know, or is it was that a
I
video?
didn't know them before I went grocery shopping,
Yeah,
but it's interesting. I see them every day at the grocery store when I go and get my newspaper, to the extent that when I didn't go for a few days and I came back, they were like, "Where have you been?"
yeah.
So how's that for connection, right?
Yeah, and that's the part I wanted to get from your perspective. These are not friends; they're just people that you've repeatedly bumped into, had a smile, and created that connection. So that's I guess what I'm getting to is that's as simple as it needs to be to help move out of this depression. Is you don't have to have these deep, long friendships with other people. It can be a simple connection like you've got there. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It would be great to have like deep friendships, but I don't think too many people have those deep friendships. And most of what we do during the course of the day are these momentary connections with other people.
That's an interesting point that you mentioned, because as you were talking about that, I was thinking about like when I was in school. I remember in primary school, I had lots of friends, and then as you move to secondary school, secondary as we call it here, um, you have less friends. And then I went off to join the army, so all the people I went to school with, I didn't connect with anymore. And you know, I don't actually anyone that I went to school with, I don't speak to anymore. And I think, is that the case? Like as an adult, you move forward, you have, maybe we look back and think, oh, I had all these friends as a school kid, and now I don't have any friends, and there's something wrong with me. Would that be something that some people are experiencing, and then wondering why, and start to go into that depression side of things?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good question. I think it's different for a lot of different people, but I know as I've transitioned into different parts of my life, friends have just sort of faded away. And mostly it's because, we may not have things in common. Some of my friends had kids way before I did. Some of my friends were less career oriented than I was. And so, yeah, I think there is that tendency to be like, okay, these people are all falling off. What's wrong with me? But I think it's just the natural process of life. And I think we also still, a lot of us carry that judgment that if you don't have a lot of friends, you're unpopular. That comes from like the school age time, that for you to be accepted, it must mean you have a huge group of friends. And I don't think that's necessarily true as an adult. I think if you have one or two good friends, I think you're way better off than most other people.
Yeah, and I mean, I just, and for the people listening as well. I mean, from my perspective, I have lots of people like yourself that I know, and I consider, I would say, friends in the sense of using the term very loosely. But if I was to say, this is for the viewers listening, if I was to say, okay, I put my hand on my heart and say, how many really really close friends do I have outside of my family? And some of my family are not my friends, um, which is normal, I think, for most people. But I have one. I could say there's one person that I would count as a really close, true friend.
Mhm.
But I have a lot of people, associates that I know, and things like that. When I compare that to when I was a kid, so just for people listening, to put that in context, we can look at people and go, oh, they've got all these friends and know all these people. But when we look at it deeper, I think it's important to remember, if you're feeling that depression, to step back a bit and go, well, that's maybe not the case.
That's maybe
So
not the case, absolutely.
yeah, I wanted to shift on as well, because we've talked a lot about anxiety and depression and things like that. You also deal a lot with work-life balance. Now, I know that would be a cause of anxiety, depression, those kind of feelings. How does someone today? Obviously, we're very different in how we operate. I mean, there's we have both parents working, or both, if they're not parents, both people in a relationship working. Um, Finding that balance for time for each other, doing the work, achieving the things you want to achieve. How does someone do that? What processes can they put in place to do that?
I think, first of all, I think work life balance, I think it's a buzzword, but I don't think it really exists. I think I think balance is, again, human beings want balance, but I think when you're juggling so many different things, I think it's very difficult to have everything balanced at once. If a child is sick, you're focused on that child. So by extension, your work is going to be unbalanced. So I think we need to look at it over the long term. During times when my kids were really small and I was raising my kids, I had no balance because I was focused more on them. So my job suffered, or I couldn't put as much into it as I wanted. As
Yeah,
the kids got older, then they became more independent. I was more likely to, or more able to put some effort into work. I think sometimes the popular culture gives us this buzzword that we should be looking for work-life balance, and it sets us up that, oh, if I'm not doing that, I must be all wrong.
Yeah.
And I think the culture doesn't help us either. Look, if we look at it, I could go on this forever. A 5-day work week really is arbitrary. There's no rule that says anywhere that the work week has to be 5 days.
Yeah.
But somehow we've came upon that, and now it's really, really hard to break that. But there's no hard and fast rule that says an economy must function 5 days a week from 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And one of the good things about COVID was that we saw some things that changed, and hopefully we can keep with some of those changes in our culture that may give us more opportunity for a parent to be working and participate in school stuff at the same time.
Yeah. So this idea of finding this work-life balance, so to speak, where you're feeling completely calm and everything's going smoothly and all okay, is not something we should be striving for. Is that?
Good luck with that. I want to talk to somebody who does it. I have not been able to figure it out because there's always guilt somewhere. If you're giving 100% to your work, you're worried about your kids. If you're giving 100% to your kids, you're worried work is going to call. I think it's a great something to aspire to, but I wouldn't hang your hat on it because I think it's too stressful.
The second part to that question is, if you found that work-life balance and everything was calm and serene, would you get bored and then look to self-sabotage?
That's great. I mean, I've often thought about that too. Like, how much do we like a little bit of a challenge in our life, something to aspire to? I don't know. I think it's great. I think if anybody can do it, I would love to hear their experiences with really feeling in balance and not having guilt about it.
How does that guilt part play? I mean, that's an interesting, because you mentioned guilt a couple of times there. Is guilt something that we are taught, or is it something that comes from a deeper survival? Like you mentioned fight or flight before. Is there much research on that, or I'm just curious because I'm just wondering where that
Well,
comes from.
in general, there's a difference between guilt and shame. So guilt is, feeling that you did something bad. Shame is that you are something bad. But I think we look at things that other people are doing and we feel guilty because we feel we're bad. We're doing something bad. We're not living up to expectations, whether they're societal expectations, family expectations. It usually comes from some sense that you're not living up to someone's standards, male or female. Gender roles are changing. Everything is changing at this point in time. But if you're standing next to a stay-at-home mom who makes all of her own organic baby food and, does everything at the school, and you're working and it's a great day for you if you remember to put on socks, it can set that thing up as, I feel really bad about myself. I feel guilty that maybe my kids are missing out on that experience.
Right. So the guilt is, there's something there that you feel it is being missed out on, and trying to find that balance. Is that like a motivator to try and find an improvement? Otherwise, you might just sit back and watch the TV all day. Is that how we can use that to our advantage?
I think it can be a motivator as long as you're realistic. Right? So somebody who chooses to be a stay-at-home parent, whether it's a mom or dad, they have different time expectations.
Yeah.
So if you're working in an office, you're going to have to understand you have different time expectations.
Yes.
So applying that person's life to your time expectations, that's not going to work.
Yeah. How much of that plays a part when we're talking about anxiety and stress, work-life balance? I mean, we add in when you've got work-life balance, but then you've got partner and yourself balance as well. So, and let's put children aside for the moment, but let's say you've got, your work and your goals you want to achieve, then your partner has their goals that they want to achieve. What can a person do to try and find that balance where you need time for yourself, but then you need to have that time with that person to develop the relationship as well? Is there techniques a person can do to help that balance?
That's all about the communication. And so what I will work with couples when I'm working with couples is this concept of over communication. So when we're first starting therapy together, a couple counseling together, I will notice that there's generally a lack in communication. People think they're talking, but they're making a lot of assumptions. They may not be doing a lot of listening. They may think they know each other so well that they can finish each other's sentences, but that's dangerous to do that because you're never really asking for and hearing the full answer. So I tell couples to over communicate, which means if you think it's something that your partner already knows, say it anyway.
Yeah.
Especially around issues surrounding love, affection. Like people will say, well, my partner knows that, that I love them. Well, really? When was the last time you said it? Well, I don't remember. Then you probably need to say it.
Yeah. How much of that connects to as well? Because I've heard that a lot of times when people think they're listening, they're really thinking about what they're going to be saying next as opposed to listening. Is that, common from your experience?
Absolutely. It takes a tremendous amount of work to just be present and to hear what another person is saying because people are afraid of silence. Silence feels awkward.
Why? What is that? That one's come up a lot. And I know like one of the trainings that I've developed is a negotiation training. And for that reason, and salespeople are always taught this as well, when you close, you shut up and don't say anything and let the uncomfortableness do the work. Why do we feel uncomfortable with silence?
That's a great one. I don't know how far back this goes, but especially nowadays, there is no silence, right? Anytime you're alone with your thoughts, pick up your phone.
Yeah.
Right? There is no opportunity to be alone with your thoughts, but silence in general makes people anxious. And what they will generally do is rush to fill the silence. And so if you can be comfortable with silence, that can really keep you from closing a deal that you really didn't want to close or not negotiating a way that you really did want to negotiate because you're just trying to fill the silence. It's a technique that therapists use to teach people to be comfortable just being alone with their thoughts, that a pause is okay. You don't necessarily have to fill a pause.
And is that a training thing? Like we've trained ourselves to need the buzz, the noise to feel, and then it's not that we've trained ourselves that the noise is normal. And then when we don't have that noise, we start to feel uncomfortable, and uncomfortable causes us pain. Would that be fair to say? And it's retraining ourselves to be comfortable with silence. Is that the case?
Totally retraining. I think also the mind may go, if neither person is saying anything, the mind may go to, well, what's that person thinking about me? So I better hurry up and say something. So so it's just being okay with it. And look, I've gone through many, many years of training. I still have trouble with silence.
Yeah.
I get it.
So we need to be, for those that are Big Bang Theory fans, be the Sheldon that can go, or is it, if you're into Star Trek, the Spock that can go hours of silence and be comfortable with that? Is that because I imagine that would also help from a communication perspective. Like a lot of times when we think we're listening, we're really ready to butt in with our own thing, and the person may not have finished. Whereas one of the techniques that, again, from negotiation perspective, in my courses is like count to 2 before when someone finishes, because they may volunteer more information. And then from a partner perspective, I noticed in relationships where people, if you're silent, they will share more of their feelings if you let them talk. Is that where silence can be helpful as well?
Absolutely. That's a true therapy thing, is if you allow the silence, someone may go deeper and say something that they weren't actually intending to say, and then it takes the therapy in a different direction. And I think it can work that way for relationships too. I've gotten into the habit with couples of recommending that they use a very small hourglass, like 1 minute or 2 minutes. And when they're communicating to practice, they put it on the table, and that person is allowed to speak for 1 minute without the other person saying anything. And then they need to paraphrase, the other person has to paraphrase back what they've heard.
Interesting, because I would imagine that again connects to the anxiety and depression you're talking about. If you're shifting that focus to what you're going to say, to listening to them and what is really coming in, would that help reduce anxiety and depression?
Absolutely, because a lot of times, we're feeling disconnected from people. Nobody understands us. Nobody hears us. That contributes to isolation. So, if you and your couple or you and your partner are stuck in a pattern where you're telling them something and they don't appear to be hearing you, this gives you guys the opportunity to find out, are we really communicating with each other?
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. Just allow that communication to happen. I want to shift now to because we're going to wind up soon, but can you tell us, you've published two books, The Wisdom of the Universe and Total Wellness for Mummies. Can you give us a bit of a synopsis about the first one, The Wisdom, or which was, I think Total Wellness for Mummies was your
Total
first?
wellness for mommy was first, right?
Yeah. So do you want to give us a bit of a summary of that so people listening to it, this is your chance to sell your wares, so to speak.
So,
um,
Total Wellness from Total Wellness for Mommies came from a woman who was writing a whole total blank for mommy series, and so mine fit in with wellness. I've been talking about wellness since I was in college in the '90s, so this was like before it was a buzzword, and so my focus has always been on body, mind, and spirit. So the book sort of talks about some of these concepts that we've discussed about just body, mind, and spirit, and so the next book sort of focused more into some of the more intuitive kind of work that I've done, focusing on motivation and integrating peace, love, compassion, empathy in your life. So the quotes are all motivational quotes on one side, and on the other side is a journal page that allows people to reflect on the quote that they have read, and they can either talk about their own goals, their own intentions, what it means to them, what it stirs up for them. So it's kind of like a workbook. What I really like about it is I designed it with pretty simple language, because my hope is really to have schools use it for kids to teach some sort of emotional intelligence and communication and motivation, and to teach them ways of expressing themselves, and also taking an idea and applying it to themselves, which in the US they were calling text to self connection. I don't know what they call it in Australia, but it's a thing that they do in English classes. So that's sort of my goal. I'd like to do wellness groups or groups of people who are interested on the more spiritual side, using their emotions, using the power of connection to reduce anxiety, to reduce depression, to break those toxic behavior chains, all of those things that we want to live our fullest life.
That part, second one, is The Wisdom from the Universe. Is that that part where you've got the quotes on one side and the reflection on the
Yes.
other side?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's interesting too, like from a parent perspective, because you mentioned about for children, for schools, but parents could use that for that reason as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it'd be a way for, and this is for the parents out there, this would be a way for connecting, not only, for helping the child's growth, but also for connecting with the child as well. Is that fair to say? You could do it together? Would it work in that way?
Absolutely. I was doing it with my daughter actually at one point when we were separated during COVID. So we were working on it together. Everything that I use, mostly everything I use in my practice, I've run through my kids as guinea pigs. So they're kind of used to all of that. So they've seen it all. So.
Fantastic. So that's Wisdom of the Universe, which is something that help your own personal spiritual growth, but also it's designed for children to be able to use as well, so that you can one as a parent help your children, but also connect with your children. By the sounds of it, sounds like a wonderful book.
Right. It's emotional language. It's spiritual. It's motivational. It's for adults. It's for kids. What I love is that there's no age range on it, because people are always looking to change.
Yeah. And where would people find it? I mean, I know it's on Amazon is one area. Where else would they find it?
So I'm actually, because the book came out during COVID, I didn't give it the opportunity to have the big book launch. So we pulled it off. I'm doing a book launch in October. So stay tuned on my website, on my social medias, because I'm going to be doing some book giveaways. I'll be having some events. I'll be able to send out the book. I'll be doing some workshops and things, and we'll be doing, book groups. So that's all going to be coming up in October.
Yeah, and you mentioned about workshop as well, and you've mentioned that a couple of times during this podcast. Is that a way for people to connect? Can they join? Do you run workshops where the public can join that as well, or?
Absolutely. So in my own transition, I've been shifting more out of the one-on-one psychotherapy. I love the groups. I love the energy of a group. I originally did theater when I was younger, so I love being on stage. So I'm moving more into a way of, okay, how can I help more people in a shorter period of time? So being on stage, doing workshops, doing, keynotes, running webinars. So I'm working to put all of that out within the next month or so. So that stuff will be posted on my website. You can send me your email address if you want to make sure that you get all the information. Follow me on my socials and you'll be part of the club.
Yeah. So your website is a key place to get this information. So I'll put that in the link here, but we've got that. So it's lauraellick.com. Is that correct?
Correct. Right.
So I'm asking the question, but it was a rhetorical question. Just for the listeners, I'm not stupid. And so the website is where you've got a lot of that detail, and your website does have your books on there, so you can purchase them there as well. How else can people reach out? You mentioned social. What socials are you active on?
So they can reach me on Instagram at Laura Ellick Real.
Yeah.
I'm also on TikTok. I believe that's Laura Ellick. LinkedIn, you can look me up on LinkedIn. That's also Dr. Laura Ellick. And I'm so open to people reaching out when they need it. Feel free to email me at lacwm93@verizon.net. If you need a workshop, want me to develop something for you or for your corporation or your school, I'm happy to do that too.
Awesome. So they can reach out and you will customize things to suit what they need, whether it's business, personal, community group, that kind of thing. Am I understanding correctly?
Absolutely. And all my full content is on YouTube at Laura Ellick.
Fantastic. Lots of places to reach out to Laura. Laura, just if we're going to leave people with 3 key things from what you teach to help them between anxiety, depression, work-life balance, what would be the 3 key things that you would suggest people focus on from Laura Ellick's perspective?
Okay, number 1 would be to take a breath. The power of taking a breath before you act cannot be overstated. So many people get into difficult situations because they feel they need to respond impulsively. Just because someone says to you, I want an answer, doesn't mean you need to give them an answer. So part of feeling empowered, which is the key to reduction in depression and anxiety, is taking that breath and being thoughtful before you respond. Number 2, you are not alone. There are likely hundreds of thousands of people who are experiencing the same exact thing that you are experiencing. And number 3, find that connection, whether it's a friend, whether it's a relative, whether it's a therapist. All you need is that one person, and there is one person out there for you.
Fantastic. That's absolutely wonderful advice, Laura. It's been so fabulous having you on the podcast. You've just shared so much wisdom and knowledge. I'm sitting there, I was taking notes, so it's like there's so much information I've read, just new information that you're sharing, and I'm so glad to have you on the show and to share. Viewers, please reach out to Laura at a connection that'll be in the blurb here with her website, social, that'll all be there. So thank you again for being on the show, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me. I had such a great time.
Thank you for being part of the Share.Care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes for others and for you.